Hey students, at this point in time, you've been able to read through the poem Between the World and Me, and hopefully you have some thoughts and you did your little thought reflection journal about what the poem is about. So my goal today is just to highlight some of the important ideas that are going on in the text and how this poem relates to the book that we're about to read of the same name. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Richard Wright first before we get started. So Richard Wright is the author of the poem, not of the book. So the author of the book is a different author. This is just the author of the poem that you read. So Richard Wright's most famous book is Native Son. Black Boy is another book they wrote that was autobiographical. That's a close second. And basically, one of the things you need to know about Richard Wright, because you'll see this show up in Ta-Nehisi Coates as well, he was a huge believer in what is called protest literature. And what he believed is that if you are a writer, especially if you're African American, you should be using your words as weapons, meaning you should be using your words to fight injustice, to fight inequality, and to really take a stance on the current state of race in our country. So he was often known for depicting the gruesome detail of reality of Black life. And a lot of people didn't like it because he was very raw and honest. Now, one of the things also that you want to know about Richard Wright is that he was not a fan of people like Nella Larson or Zora Neale Hurston, especially Zora Neale Hurston. The two of them did not get along so well. Mostly because Richard Wright felt like they were not taking a big stance, that they were writing for entertainment and they weren't taking an open and outright stance against inequality. So Richard Wright is the author of the poem. So if the poem struck you, and if it made you emotional at all because of the depiction of the lynching that is described there, that's what it was actually designed to do. So I'm going to just go through a couple of the things that I want you to be aware of that are in the poem, just a couple of the stanzas that I find very interesting. So the first one says, "And one morning, while in the woods, I stumbled suddenly upon the thing." Now, I want you to kind of stick on that word, the thing, because it's important to note that he doesn't say a body, he doesn't say a skeleton, he doesn't say human remains. He kind of dwells on this idea of a thing, meaning that it's almost dehumanized. It goes on to say, "Stumbled upon it in a grassy clearing guarded by scaly oaks and elms, and the city details of the scene rose, thrusting themselves between the world and me." Now, I want you to pay attention to the connotation that is all throughout this poem. You will see if you pay attention to the word choices, they're all very violent. So they have a very violent connotation that's happening. Now, in this last line here, he says, "thrusting themselves between the world and me," which is where we get the title of the poem. And here we see Richard Wright kind of reflecting on this idea that pops up way from W.E.B. Du Bois that we talked about there being two worlds and African Americans are living behind the veil. And it's touching on this same idea of double consciousness, of not being able to fully embrace and be who you are in the world because the world does not accept you. Now, some topics in the poem that you're also going to see represented in the book by Ta-Nehisi Coates is number one, Black lives over time throughout history have consistently been dehumanized and marginalized. So that's something big. You're going to see it all over the text. Another one is that there's an unattainable acceptance of the world that Black people can never really get to. And so it's this idea that there's the dream, the American dream. And yes, you can kind of reach it, but you'll never really fully be accepted because in reality, you live in another world. Here's the second stanza. "There was a design of white bones slumbering, forgotten upon the cushion of ashes." Okay, again, notice that word forgotten, which again marginalizes the impact of what is happening here. By the way, if you didn't catch on, this is the author who wrote this poem has stumbled upon the site of a lynching. And so he's kind of reflecting on this lynching, and that's where this poem comes out. So there was a charred stump of a sapling pointing a blunt finger accusingly at the sky. There were torn tree limbs, tiny veins of burnt leaves, and a scorched coil of greasy hemp. Notice there again the torn tree limbs, right? Tiny veins of burnt leaves, scorched coil, right? So all of those very violent, which depicts the lynching. A vacant shoe, an empty tie, a ripped shirt, a lonely hat, and a pair of trousers stiff with black blood. So not only was it a violent lynching, which all lynchings were violent, not only was it completely dehumanizing, but we see that the person there has to die alone, right? That there is a sense that this person has to die alone. Their vacant shoe, the empty, the lonely hat, that they are going through this awful experience by themselves. Okay. And then upon the trampled grass were buttons, dead matches, butt ends of cigars and cigarettes, peanut shells, a drained gin flask, and a whore's lipstick. Scattered traces of tar, restless arrays of feathers, and the lingering smell of gasoline. And through the morning air, the sun poured yellow surprise into the eye sockets of this stony skull. And what I want to point out here in this stanza is that lynchings were often community events. So they were a domestic act of terrorism that the community rallied behind, and they made an event out of it. And so I want to show you, and some of these pictures are going to be a little gruesome, so brace yourself if you don't want to see them. But lynchings were not just hangings. Okay, I want you to get that clear. It wasn't just that they took somebody and hanged them on the tree. That was not exactly what a lynching was. A lynching was mutilation, where with men, they would often cut off their genitals. It was a form of dehumanization. They were often tarred and feathered. They were burned often. They were, there's just the list goes on. And many times, as the community would rally around this, they would bring their children, they would bring popcorn, they would bring peanuts, and they would enjoy the lynching and the mutilation of a Black body as if it was something to be entertained by. And it was a common practice. So this poem, again with Richard Wright, is trying to highlight this idea that this awful thing is forgotten. And our country kind of takes it so lightly, especially when we talk about it in history. And then the rest of the poem kind of centers around this idea that we can see kind of summed up in this particular stanza where he says, the gin flask passed from mouth to mouth, cigars and cigarettes glowed, the whore smeared lipstick red upon her lips, and 1,000 faces swirled around me, clamoring that my life be burned. And the idea here is that the man who stumbled upon this lynching has no security because he feels like what had been demanded of the person who was lynched will one day be demanded of him simply because they are both Black. And so he has this realization that as he stumbles upon this lynching site, that is also a similar fate that he undoubtedly could possibly have to face. And so you're going to see this idea also pop up in our book as well, Between the World and Me. One last thing about the poem that I want you to be aware of is that the poem represents what Richard Wright kind of felt, which was that there was always, being a Black man in America, there's always going to be a separation, right? There's always going to be a separate experience that as a Black person living in the United States, you're going to see the world differently and through a different lens because of the history of race and racism in our country. Okay, so what does this poem have to do with the book? Because they have the same name. Obviously, they have something to do with each other. Okay, one, the poem is an epigraph. So the poem is the overarching epigraph of the whole book. And remember, we talked about an epigraph when we were first talking about Nella Larsen's book, right? That an epigraph is a short little excerpt of something that hints at the topics and the themes in the book. So when we were talking about the ideas of Black bodies not being valued, that idea is going to show up again in our book. Two, the book is protest literature. I would clarify it as, I would categorize it as protest literature, even though some may not. But Coates definitely offers a bleak look at the world, right, through the eyes of a Black man, and it very much makes a statement. It's a very modern day statement about the state of America. Three, we're going to see this idea of the American dream pop up, and I want you to be thinking about that idea of the American dream as we read. For the concept of race and racism, that's going to be huge. It's going to challenge you to think about race and racism. Five, the idea of Black bodies, which again, we've seen in the poem. It's going to double over into the book. And then six, this idea of double consciousness. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the video, but in the poem Between the World and Me, it's a direct reflection of Du Bois's idea of Blackness and the veil. If you remember from first semester, we talked about Du Bois and his idea of always living behind his skin color and always having to see the world through another person's eyes and being very aware of how people saw him because he was Black. So that idea you're going to see popping up again. It's in the poem. It's also in the book. All right, so a couple of things about the book, and this is important and it's helpful. Okay, number one, the book is a letter. It's literally a letter that Coates wrote to his son. So it reads as a letter. Because of that, there are not chapters in the book. So the book is separated by sections, but not separated by chapters. So you need to pay attention on Learn at BCS what page numbers I assign you to read, because it won't be by chapters, it'll be by page numbers. So it really helps if we all get the same book so that you know what page numbers you're supposed to read. Another quick tip for you is that Ta-Nehisi Coates has been heavily influenced by another author called James Baldwin, who we talked about very briefly when we were talking about passing. So his style is very much mirrored in the idea of Baldwin. So if you like Ta-Nehisi Coates when you read it, I highly suggest you go back and read some Baldwin as well. The last tip I want to give you is that the audiobook, if you buy it from Audible, is actually really helpful. The author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, reads it and it's beautiful. He does a beautiful reading of his own book. And I highly recommend you get the audiobook, but it's not a substitute for having the physical book in front of you. So don't buy the audio if you're not going to get the physical book as well. And that physical book could be the digital copy as well. But it's just helpful. I find it helpful to hear him reading it. It just gives a deeper meaning and sense to it that I really enjoy. All right, so your next steps. You're going to start reading the book. You're going to read pages 5 through 9. Now, before you freak out and say, why are we starting on page 9? The book actually starts on page 9. I mean, on page 5. My bad. And then I want you, as you are reading pages 5 to 9, it won't take you too long to do. I want you to annotate, underline, highlight every mention of the topic body. So anytime you see the word body, any mention or reference to body, I want you to highlight or underline that. Also, I want you to highlight or underline any discussion of race or racism. He's going to try to define race and racism. I want you to make sure you underline that. The third thing, I want you to underline any idea that he hints at of there being this idea of two worlds, or him having to live in between two worlds. So that's it. Hope that that all made sense for you guys. And I think we're good to go. So we'll see you guys later. Bye.